Sam, thank you so much for setting up some time to have a conversation about your background. Let's just dive into it. How did you first get into composing?
So ultimately, me starting composing leads back to a question of my first instrument, right? So the first musical instrument that I learned to play, which is, I guess, it's very stereotypical drummer. Like I'm a drummer that's my main instrument. So like, I guess my first instrument was like the pots and pans in the kitchen. Very stereotypical, like drummer starting, right? And I guess it was just a fascination with, how stuff sounds. That was probably when I was about 10 or so. And then I kind of learned to play the drums throughout middle school and high school. And then eventually, spending enough time in the music room in my high school, eventually I was writing some like songs here and there, and I was always influenced by like progressive rock of like the 70s. That was like probably influenced by my dad, but I was influenced by a lot of that kind of music. And that led me to, maybe I would like, classical music and, orchestral music. And it definitely lent itself to, if you like progressive rock, you'll probably like orchestral music because there's a lot of the same tropes and a lot of the same like method of writing. So that led me to apply to Wilford Laurier University, which is the local great music university around here in Waterloo, Ontario. That ultimately got my career started in composing, hanging around with all different types of musicians, learning what parts you should write, learning what parts you maybe shouldn't write for musicians, when you have the luxury of using real musicians, that is. But you got to spend a lot of time in university just learning about how different instruments they like to read, what kind of parts they like to play. And yeah, after 4 years of doing that, I majored in music theory and music composition. So I did a lot of like theory mentoring, helping people, write better harmonies and whatnot, and actually pass their theory courses. And then I always had like private music theory students as well after school. And I've worked a lot. My composing journey after school was a lot mainly geared towards playing with live musicians, less so recording and doing like actual DAW work. Although I'd always dabbled with that a little bit, my main background was in live concerts, Fortunately enough, I actually got the opportunity to write for a full orchestra, which is awesome, through an Ontario Arts Council grant, which was really special because sometimes it could be hard to find, avenues to actually write for a full orchestra because they're very expensive to, gather all that many musicians in one place. But fortunately, I was able to get a lot of experiences like that. As a drummer, I played also with a lot of orchestras, so that also helps. Mm-hmm. On top of that, I've also played in like jazz quartets, ranges of percussion ensembles. My latest performance in a percussion ensemble setting has actually been with a group that plays traditional West African music. So it's really awesome to be able to, have that many, diverse, performance experiences. And that's kind of what I bring to composing and try to bring to, when we're just producing music in a DAW, is trying to bring like a kind of real life aspect to it as much as it's possible. And more recently, I have also decided to get into the video game space. And right now I'm actually working with a local developer to make like a unannounced like rhythm music game. So I'm kind of like developing that and writing the music for that as well. So, and that's like kind of my most recent avenue of music.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you've definitely got a diverse background and really, really interesting to see, like, yeah, the progression of your career. A couple questions for you here. Like, are there any musical, specific, like, composers or musicians or even scores, soundtracks that really, like, influenced your style? Or is there one that really stands out more so than the others?
I am definitely a big Star Wars lover, so I always love the music of Star Wars. Those are like a lot of composers just absolutely, adore John Williams' scores, and I especially like the Star Wars music. So that's definitely a heavy influence on me. Anytime you have an influence, but you have a project that you have to, meet the needs of, it's always really fun, like combining what your personal style is versus maybe what style should be applied to the project. It's hard to like navigate that boundary sometimes because ultimately I'll have like a style. Like I like doing like huge, big orchestrations, and sometimes not every project calls for that. So sometimes you have to find a way to bridge what will inspire you to work on a project while also fulfilling the needs of your client. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Do you have a favorite collaboration that you've done in your career? Something that stands out as like, oh, this was my favorite project, my favorite collaboration working with, video creator, filmmaker. Just curious if there's anything that stands out.
I've worked with some like live music. Like, so I used to be in a group that mixed like live musical theater and then like contemporary art music. Basically, we would do musical theater performances, but the performers were also musicians as well. So it was kind of a blend between like kind of visual acting, like basically performance art, like in a space. And then you kind of had to coordinate with whoever was writing the script, to make sure that the music was going to work and flow nicely within like that setting. That's probably the coolest collaboration I've done. That's a collaboration with something that has like a visual medium to it, like a performance or whatever. So
This is really cool to hear. Another question I had for you, and this one is I always love to ask composers, like, is there one or two things that make you stand out as a composer? Or I guess like what could be those one or two things that you're like, this is my distinct style, this is what maybe separates me from other musicians and other composers, and it's unique to me.
yeah, but I guess my uniqueness is tied to the fact that I'm a drummer and a percussionist. So I
Hmm.
know that people will frequently say, "Oh, this music sounds like it was written by like a drummer or by a percussionist or something like that." Some other people have called it they've called it groove, for lack of a better word, right? It just has a kind of groove to it that feels like a drummer playing something groovy on a drum kit or something, right? That's what I think makes a lot of my stuff unique, is it always has like a kind of groove to it, as well as because I have like an extended like music theory background. I am quite familiar with how to get like really big orchestral sections, which I think is important to making your music sound like fairly full, is being able to map out where all the specific pitches are and where the instruments are to get the most full sound possible. So I guess that's what also makes me stand out too. Very big, like orchestral sections.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'd love to dive into that and kind of shift gears and maybe talk about your process for composing music. So, why don't we pivot into diving into a piece of music that you composed in your DAW, and would love to take a peek behind the scenes and see how you put that together. So, yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, cool. So I guess I'll go through, because I'm going through this Jedi Survivor demo that I put together, because it's a piece that it's a score to picture type of format. I'm going to go over a little bit of the video first too, but
Perfect.
yeah. Okay. So, all right. So when I started thinking about what music should be in this project, I'll just like mute all the music so we can listen to it. I'll do some sections here without the music. When I go through a video like this, I tend to try to find where the big sections are going to be first. So the big orchestration sections. So at the beginning of the video, because you can see there's kind of like a dramatic start, the camera then focuses in right here. So I knew that the start of this video should be something dramatic. So that's where I got this musical cue. And it's actually this first musical phrase actually starts on just a single note. I think it might be separated by octaves, but then it expands into like a big orchestral chord. So then you can see how that sounds. And then I wanted it to kind of feel like it was going somewhere. So then that's where I got the strings playing 16th notes. But then music aside, then I wanted to find all the areas of the video that were going to be the big moments. So the beginning is a big moment, and then if we switch here, the other big moment is where he stands up and looks off into the distance, but then later on he stands up and looks at the temple. This is another big moment that I wanted in the music. So that's where I layered basically as many instruments on top of each other as I could. All the strings, all the woodwinds, all the brass, all at the same time. So I wanted to map out these big sections first, because that's what I find is easier for me to write as a composer, is just these big orchestral sections, and then I have to like strip it back and then work out the other parts later. So that's another big section. And I don't know if you want to interject with any questions while I'm doing this, but feel free.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and maybe let's just set the scene for what we're looking at in your DAW. So you're using Reaper.
I'm using Reaper, yes.
You're primarily composing and orchestrating in the box using VSTs.
Yes.
Are there certain instruments that you gravitate towards as you're creating these big orchestral sections? Like, how do you go about sort of selecting the right sound at first? Because I know from myself personally and a lot of other composers and musicians, it's like there are so many sounds, there are so many different kind of like palettes and colors you can play with. How do you go about just like organizing that first?
That's why I always start with the big sections, because I know I'm probably just going to have all the instruments playing all at once.
Okay.
That's part of my strategy to, not being too overwhelmed, because after you create a few like big sections and a few sections that are going to have like all the instruments going all at once, I find it a little bit easier to strip back the orchestration from that, which is why I always start with the bigger sections and then kind of fill it in afterward. I find that helps me. But luckily with the large sections, you don't have to worry too much. You can kind of just layer all of them if you want.
Right on. Right on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Feel free to continue going down the track here.
Are you interested in seeing like what I'm using as far as VSTs go before I go too far in?
Sure. Yeah. Why don't we pull it up
Okay.
and just you can talk through that however much detail you'd like to.
Sure. I'll start with the woodwinds because they're usually, you always start with the woodwinds at the top of the score. And I try to set up the instruments in my DAW to score order when possible, when it makes sense, just to keep yourself organized. But as far as like the woodwinds go, I like to have I actually use a VST. It's from audio modeling and it's called like the SWAM instruments. What I really like about them is they're fully synthesized. So they're not actually like sample based. That technology has existed for quite a couple years now, but it's only really gotten like realistic in the last, year or two, I think. Because I find that if I try to use sample libraries for like woodwind instruments, I find that I just get bogged down by so many different articulations and different track, because essentially what I would used to do is I used to set up a different track for each articulation, and it's a little bit overwhelming to work that way, right? So what I like about these instruments is I can literally just, arm it and then just start playing. Right? So you can control the vibrato, control the dynamics, and control a lot of the parameters with these instruments in a much more like human and like realistic way. So that's what I like to work with for woodwinds. I like to work with the kind of SWAM collection.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as brass goes, I use some Project Sam stuff and some Spitfire stuff, just some like bigger, just to get usually I want like a pretty big brassy sound. So I usually just kind of try to layer as many different brass instruments on top of each other to get that big sound.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I tend to use for brass. And then percussion is kind of all over the place. I have a lot of different contact instruments that are all just kind of like random percussion instruments. And I have a lot of my own percussion I will like record sometimes. But honestly, I found that I almost would rather just almost create a sampler instrument of me playing. I not even record it into the part, because sometimes if you want to change the tempo on the fly while you're composing, having to like re-record the part can kind of feel a little bit like you kind of get out of the moment of writing, right? So I like to always have things like in MIDI when possible, so you can kind of change the tempo and kind of change it around. And it's also helpful, if someone was like, hey, like I really like what you wrote, but can it be a little bit faster? Being able to just press a button and turn the tempo a little bit faster is very helpful rather than like re-recording a part. So that's why I always try to have it in MIDI when possible, or at least chopped up so that I don't have to re-record the part again. And then for strings, I use the BBC Symphony library for the most part. I also like to intersperse some individual strings. So the SWAM collection also has string instruments too. And I like to layer a couple like individual strings on top of the group strings. That way you get a slightly different vibrato, a slightly different like volume you can modulate for each instrument. That way it kind of sounds fuller and sounds a little bit more realistic.
Awesome. Is there any chance you could isolate a few of those tracks just so you can hear them separately?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. So I'll start with that beginning phrase, mainly because I'm there in the DAW, so it's easiest, and it starts the piece. So I'll see if that's... All right, so that's the full orchestration, and let's solo maybe just the one violin part. So this is the BBC like group strings. And then layered on top of that is a individual like SWAM synthesized string, like violin. So it's a much more intimate sounds. It almost sounds like it's like a concert leader in the orchestra. So it kind of like it's kind of fun to have some of these instruments stick out. And then another violin, maybe with a slightly different vibrato. And then if I layer all those violins on top of each other, then you get a pretty like full sound with a nice chorus effect. And then I did that for most of the other strings as well. And then if you want to hear just the strings, this is just for the strings.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it comes together.
Yeah, and it's nice. I really, at the beginning, I really tried to make it open up as much as possible, which is why I started on that single note and then expand out into like a bigger orchestration, descending like bass line and whatnot, and ascending melody. So this is the bass line. I just put it in the cellos though. I only put the bass at that last phrase with the timpani. So, and then the melody goes the opposite direction. So let's zoom it in here. So the melody goes up, while the bass line descends, right? So you get like a kind of, contrary motion going to make it kind of really expand into something that it makes you feel like, oh, it just really opens up at the beginning of the scene, right? And then a lot of the other parts are just doubling what was happening in strings. So then there's a trumpet part. And then the trombone, and then there's a lot of inner harmonies. I wish I had the voice leading chart I could show you, but I don't know where I put it. I put it on this music stand somewhere, and I don't know where it is. So I wish I could show you the voice leading, but I can't. And then all the brass is mainly just doubling. All the other parts are mainly just doubling strings or filling in a part after I did the voice leading, and then the woodwinds only come in on the last chord. Let me solo all the woodwinds. They only actually happen in the very, very last chord, just to make it feel like it's kind of expanding into something. But I didn't put any runs at the beginning, but didn't want it to sound. You got to make sure that you don't put all your tricks at the beginning too. You got to save the tricks for later too.
That's a good tip.
Yeah, that's a breakdown of the beginning anyway.
Yeah, I really love drilling down, kind of uncovering your workflow, what works for you. Also, too, like for my personal learning, and other composers out there, it's just nice to see like how other musicians go about arranging and how they, even just simple things like how their templates are set up. I love anything that can improve the workflow and kind of get music out quicker in a more efficient way, but still obviously have it be high quality.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing to get your workflow down. I know that I was using Logic for the longest amount of time, and I really got frustrated with the lack of ability to create shortcuts in Logic. Like the reason why I actually love Reaper is because every single action, whether I'm putting like an EQ or putting effect on something or opening up some menu somewhere where I would have to click like 5 times to get into, a lot of the times in Reaper, like you have the ability to map any kind of action. So like that's why I gravitated, and moved to Reaper, because I can use a lot more shortcuts and be able to like map things a lot easier and get to menus in a way that, doesn't allow me to, I don't have to click 5 times to get into a menu. I find that kind of ruins the workflow for sure as well. So it's also got really some benefits in like the game audio space. When you're doing like game stuff, it can really be helpful, but it's kind of a separate thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go through the form I was talking about before. So by just identifying the big moments. Another big moment in the video is where the ships, and I should also say that with this demo, I tried to really map the music to the camera angle. That was like kind of my approach. I find that at any time that you're like scoring a scene, it's good to have something. Now, sometimes that'll be dialogue, like the pillar. You'll always have like a pillar that you use to like score to. Most of the time in a scene, it'll be dialogue or like crucial sound effects. However, in this demo, it's mainly just like an action scene with the main character. flying through a spaceship and then landing on the planet in this big city. So that's what I decided to use as a pillar, was the camera angle. So a lot of the music you'll see in this demo has the music almost very tightly mapped to whatever camera angle is that you're looking at. And that's kind of what I use to create movement and action within the scene. The other big moment, I talked about where he stands up and looks at the temple. The other big moment is actually where the spaceship lands. So I wanted to make this section here with the spaceship landing as like a big moment. You'll hear here that the cadence matches the ship falling. So that was the other big moment. I'll let you hear that again. So you can hear how the last note while the ship's falling is actually the cadence point, right? So the whole scene is the ship flying, and then when the ship eventually lands, that's when all the music stops, and where I decided to end the musical cue. So
that's a great call out, and I'm also curious too at this point, or just maybe in general with this composition, how did you come up with the melody?
Well, that's actually one of the things that I really struggle with, is getting like a first like theme or a first melody, right? But for this demo, I just decided it to be just like basically a triad ascending upward and then descent. So I basically decided the whole musical cue would be based off of this melody here. Da, 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 da. Mm-hmm. So I decided to use that, minor chord going up and then to descending on the top to be the musical theme for basically the whole composition. So you can hear that spliced throughout. So that's kind of how I came up with the main melody. I just wanted it to feel minor, but kind of a little bit mysterious at the same time. So that's why I kind of decided to descend by a semitone up top of the melody. And also the types of harmonies that I use in this whole orchestration, which is like very like romantic. Ultimately, John Williams is like a kind of like a romantic person. Basically, he kind of takes an influence from a lot of composers in like the 1800s, and they used a particular style of triads and the way they fit together. That's not in like a functional way, so it's not like exactly in a key. It's kind of triads just kind of morphing into each other. So I use those kind of triad transformations to try to come up with the melody, because I knew that I wanted to use a lot of those harmonies. So I wanted to make sure that melody fit with the harmonies that I was planning to use. I tend to try to come up with my melodies. I will like rewrite the harmonies later to fit the melody, but I try to base my melodies around what the harmony is. Because for me, the harmony is what kind of dictates the mood, right? So that's kind of how I came up with the melody.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. I haven't necessarily heard that from other musicians and composers, but again, this goes to show you that like every composer is unique and has a different approach to how they craft the melodies, harmonies, how it all works together. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it for sure. There's a really cool section where there's a camera angle here that I'll show it to you. Let me try to find it, where the ship is just like going down. And what I really, to the point where I'm trying to make the camera angle really the focal of the music, where the harmony actually moves the most is where this ship is, just basically descending, right? And the harmony also descends. So you can hear how the harmony kind of moves down just slightly, and I'm trying to map that with the actual action shot of the ship falling into this corridor. So it's kind of a cool moment, and obviously it's a big brassy moment too. So I think that section had a bunch of French horns layered on top of each other with trumpets and low brass and whatnot. So
awesome. This has been really fascinating, Sam. Just diving into your score, learning some of the tips and tricks, some of the things that help you as a composer craft melodies, arrange, even some of the sort of nuances of like the DAWs and the preferences that you have. I mean, it's all really interesting stuff. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your score. Any parting words, any I guess maybe last bit of advice or tips you would give to other musicians or composers when they're thinking about how to craft the perfect score for their video?
I mentioned it earlier, but I think the most important part of scoring any scene or anything is understanding what's the crux or what's the pillar, right? So in my demo, I decided that that pillar would be the camera angle because I thought that would be the most interesting and an effective way to create action and movement throughout the shot. So definitely you have to find a pillar. A lot of the times, if there's going to be dialogue, your pillar is going to be the dialogue because you don't want big orchestral moments over dialogue. It wouldn't mix very well. But yeah, that's the most important part is finding a pillar that you can, score to, right? So instead, because oftentimes when we write music that is not to picture, we can kind of pick whatever form we want, right? We can pick, oh, I'm going to do this for 8 bars because I kind of feel like it, and no one's really going to have any problems with it. But once you like score to picture or something like that, you have to really find a pillar in the scene to go off of.
Yeah, that's great advice, and that's something that takes a lot of practice, and I feel like a lot of time to truly master. Right?
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate the conversation. It was great chatting with you.